What if some knowledge doesn't disappear, but waits? Long before satellites traced coastlines from orbit, before sonar pierced the dark beneath polar ice, before longitude could be measured with certainty, human beings still tried to understand the shape of their world. They stood at the edge of seas with imperfect tools and incomplete maps, and yet, sometimes, they drew things that seemed to exceed the limits of their age. This story begins not with answers, but with unease. A quiet discomfort that arises when familiar timelines no longer fit as neatly as we expect. History, after all, is usually taught as a steady climb, one discovery stacked neatly upon the next. First ignorance, then knowledge. First darkness, then light. But what if that climb isn't as straight as we imagine? In archives and libraries around the world, there exist maps that feel out of place in time. Not because they are beautiful or old, many ancient maps are, but because they appear to know things they shouldn't. Coastlines drawn with confidence centuries before explorers reached them. Continents outlined beneath ice long before anyone could see what lay below. Oceans sketched before they were officially found. These maps do not shout. They whisper. They sit quietly in collections, often dismissed as curiosities, misinterpretations, or imaginative flourishes. And for the most part, history moves on without them. Yet when viewed together, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. Imagine a scholar leaning over parchment by lamplight, copying lines from a source older than their own lifetime. Imagine a navigator trusting a chart whose origins are already forgotten. Imagine knowledge passed hand to hand, century to century, slowly losing its explanation but not its shape. This is not a story about lost super-civilizations or secret histories whispered by shadowy figures. It is something subtler, and perhaps more human. A story about memory, about how information survives not as a pristine truth, but as fragments, copied, translated, misunderstood, preserved by accident, rather. It started with a piece of parchment, forgotten in a palace attic. In 1929, during routine renovations at Istanbul's Topkapi Palace, a rolled fragment of gazelle skin emerged from centuries of dust. It bore unfamiliar lines and faded ink, a coastline here, a contour there. At first glance, it seemed like one of many Ottoman-era documents. But when a German theologian unrolled it, the world changed, if only a little. This was the map of Piri Reis. Dated to 1513, signed by an admiral of the Ottoman Imperial Navy, the map revealed something extraordinary. It portrayed the coasts of West Africa and South America with unsettling precision, decades before such accuracy was considered possible. But the real mystery sat at the southern edge of the map, a stretch of land curving where no known land should be. What appeared to be the northern coastline of Antarctica, drawn 3 centuries before its official discovery. And even stranger, Antarctica without ice. This wasn't speculation. In 1960, the U.S. Air Force compared the map's southern coastline to seismic profiles gathered during the 1949 Byrd Antarctic expedition. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Z. Ohlmeyer confirmed in writing that the map's contours closely matched Queen Maud Land's subglacial coastline, terrain that lies beneath nearly a mile of ice and hasn't been visible in over 6,000 years. How? Piri Reis himself left clues. On the map, he annotated his sources. 20 charts, he claimed, some dating to the time of Alexander the Great. One was reportedly a map owned by Christopher Columbus. He wasn't inventing a coastline, he was compiling a memory. Mainstream historians urge caution. They argue that what appears to be Antarctica is likely a distorted extension of South America, a cartographic mistake magnified by modern wishful thinking. After all, many other features on the map are incorrect or exaggerated. But the mathematical projection of the mysterious southern land, when adjusted for 16th century mapping techniques, doesn't align with South America. It aligns with Antarctica's sub-ice topography. The implications are unsettling. Either a Renaissance-era admiral accessed remarkably accurate information centuries ahead of his time, or someone long before him had already done the mapping. Some researchers, like Charles Hapgood, proposed that Piri Reis was unknowingly copying ancient sea charts, fragments of a lost civilization capable of global maritime exploration during the last ice age. Others point toward forgotten libraries. Alexandria, Constantinople, perhaps even more ancient centers of learning whose collections quietly seeded the maps of later empires. And then there's the question of longitude. In 1513, no known tool existed to measure longitude accurately at sea. That problem wasn't solved until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. Yet the Piri Reis map displays South American coastlines with a precision that suggests otherwise. The idea of an ancient, highly skilled civilization is tempting, but also speculative. Perhaps the truth is more fragmented, more human. Generations of travelers sharing knowledge, copying charts, adjusting coastlines, passing along pieces of something bigger than they understood. What we know is this: the Piri Reis map exists. Its Antarctic coastline matches a reality hidden beneath thousands of years of ice, and its creator claimed no genius of his own, only that he had copied from older maps whose origins were already distant in his time. So we are left with a question, not an answer. How did Piri Reis draw what he could not have seen? Perhaps he didn't. Perhaps someone else did. And the map is their whisper, carried forward through centuries, waiting for us to listen. 18 years later, in Paris, a royal mathematician would draw a second map. One even more detailed, even more impossible. And it, too, would show Antarctica, not as a wasteland of ice, but as a living, flowing land, etched with rivers and mountains no one had yet discovered. It began with a shape, a heart. In 1531, the French mathematician Laurent Fine sat in his study at the Collège Royal in Paris, crafting a world map that would captivate cartographers for centuries. Using an elegant cordiform projection, two lobes resembling a heart, he unfolded the known world with mathematical precision. But at the bottom of that heart, nestled near the South Pole, lay something no one could explain: Antarctica. Not just a vague southern landmass or a speculative idea, but a detailed continent. Mountains rose in the interior, rivers wound through valleys, bays carved into a rugged coastline. It was a depiction not of fantasy, but of topography, landscape features that would not be discovered for another 400 years. And all of it lay beneath what modern science now knows to be a mile-thick sheet of ice. Laurent Fine, Latinized as Orontius Phineus, was no mystic. He was a royal scholar, a professor of mathematics and astronomy, an inventor of instruments. His work was rooted in numbers, not myth. And yet here he was, drawing a continent that science had yet to confirm, with details that eerily aligned with the seismic surveys of the 20th century. What could he possibly have known? When Captain Arlington Mallory and researcher Charles Hapgood re-examined the Fine map in the 1960s, they noticed startling correlations. The width of the continent matched modern Antarctica within 1,000 miles. The mountains mirrored the trans-Antarctic range. The rivers appeared to correspond with subglacial valleys, revealed only in the International de Paris, 1737. The French Royal Academy of Sciences gathers in quiet anticipation. Philippe Bouache, the king's geographer, stands before a room of learned men and presents something both bold and baffling, a map of Antarctica unlike any before it. Not a single frozen continent, but two distinct land masses, divided by a sea channel running from the Weddell Sea on one side to the Ross Sea on the other. In Bouache's time, Antarctica had not yet been officially discovered. No ship had sailed its icy coast. No expedition had confirmed its shape. Yet here it was, on parchment, divided with geometric elegance. His peers raised eyebrows. Most dismissed it as educated guesswork, an imaginative symmetry perhaps meant to balance the poles. But 2 centuries later, in 1958, seismic studies during the International Geophysical Year would confirm Boachi's claim. Beneath the ice lies a rift, a bedrock channel separating West and East Antarctica. Remove the ice and you would see exactly what Boachi drew. How could he have known? Boachi wasn't an eccentric outlier. He was one of the most respected cartographers of his age, publishing extensively on geography, ocean currents, and global structure. His work influenced Enlightenment thinking on geology and hydrography. He wasn't inventing for fantasy's sake. He was modeling the Earth. He claimed ancient sources, charts and reports from older civilizations, Portuguese and Spanish navigation records, some possibly inherited from classical libraries. But he never named them specifically. Their identities faded, leaving only the assertion that he was compiling, not creating. The precision of Boachi's Antarctic depiction is uncanny. His stereographic projection places the dividing channel almost exactly where seismic scans later confirmed it to be. Even modern elevation maps of the continent, like the BedMap 2 project, show a similar division hidden beneath the ice. West Antarctica and East Antarctica are, in fact, geologically distinct. And yet, for more than 200 years, no one took his depiction seriously. Why? Because at the time, Antarctica was a myth, a white void on most maps. Expeditions had skirted the southern oceans, but found only drifting icebergs and frigid winds. The idea of charting its interior structure before even seeing its coastline was unthinkable. Boachi's map, to many, was elegant nonsense. But what if it wasn't? The mainstream explanation is one of lucky reasoning. If the Arctic had straits and archipelagos, why not the Antarctic? Perhaps Boachi assumed the same structure, a mirrored world beneath the pole. Maybe he guessed, and guessed correctly. But his map wasn't vague. It wasn't just a symmetrical flourish. He drew a specific rift, in a specific location, matching a specific geological reality discovered centuries later with modern instruments. That kind of luck is rare. So again, we return to the question of sources. Did Boachi have access to ancient maritime charts hidden in monastery archives or royal libraries? Could Portuguese navigators, who had ventured further than officially admitted, have brought back sketches of icy lands glimpsed through fog? Or did Boachi inherit something older, a copy of a map drawn during a time when Antarctica was not yet buried in ice? This idea, though controversial, keeps resurfacing. That during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower and climate warmer in certain regions, parts of Antarctica may have been ice-free. If a seafaring civilization existed then, however briefly, it could have charted the land and passed that knowledge forward through generations of mapmakers. No proof, only maps. Silent witnesses inked on vellum. Boachi's map now sits among the curiosities of Enlightenment geography, often overlooked, often misread. But its prediction came true, and so we are left with the same uneasy conclusion. Either Boachi made a stunningly accurate guess, or he was repeating knowledge already ancient in his time. The next map takes us north, to the top of the world, and there another impossibility awaits. A forgotten sea, a magnetic mountain, and a mapmaker whose name is still with us today, not for what he found, but for how he changed the way we see the world. Duisburg, 1569. The sky is heavy with the scent of ink and oil as Gerardus Mercator leans over his latest masterpiece, a world map that will change navigation forever. But tucked within this celebrated chart, amid familiar coastlines and trade routes, lies a quiet anomaly. At the top of the map, in a circular polar inset, Mercator draws something extraordinary. An Arctic without ice. At its center, a black magnetic mountain rises from the sea. 4 massive rivers flow outward, dividing the polar region into 4 symmetrical islands. He labels the mountain Rupes Nigra, the Black Rock. No European had yet reached the North Pole. No recorded expedition had pierced that frozen domain. And yet Mercator maps it with confidence and clarity, as though describing a place long known. Where did this knowledge come from? Mercator, born in 1512, was not a fantasist. He was the most respected cartographer of the Renaissance, mathematician to emperors, the father of the map projection still used today. He pioneered magnetic declination studies, how compass readings shift across the globe, and was deeply engaged with the empirical science of geography. And yet he drew the Arctic not as a blank expanse, but as a geometric whole. 4 rivers flowing from a whirlpool surrounding a magnetic mountain, features found in no surviving records of polar exploration. He cited a source, a lost 14th century manuscript called Inventio Fortunatae, supposedly written by an English monk who claimed to have journeyed to the pole. That text, once referenced by John Dee and other scholars, has since vanished. No copies survive, only Mercator's map remembers it. Was it fiction, allegory, or memory? Mainstream historians argue that Mercator was simply repeating medieval cosmology. The idea of 4 rivers flowing from paradise appears in biblical tradition. The central mountain resembles the Axis Mundi, the mythic pillar connecting heaven and earth. In this reading, Mercator filled in the unknown with philosophical symmetry. But this theory ignores a crucial detail: the accuracy of the surrounding coastlines. Mercator's renderings of Greenland, Iceland, and northern Scandinavia far exceed the accuracy of his era. Long before detailed surveys, he depicted these northern lands with startling precision, and recent submarine studies of the Arctic basin reveal structural features that, though not identical, faintly echo the layout Mercator described. Could it be that his sources contained fragments of real exploration? Some suggest Norse voyagers whose sagas describe the distant northern islands and mysterious lands across the ice. Others point to lost Phoenician or even Bronze Age expeditions, later filtered through monastic libraries and inherited by Renaissance scholars. But the most curious detail is the magnetic mountain. Mercator was a scientist. He studied magnetism and compass variation intensely. He wouldn't lightly invent a magnetic pole without reason. What if he was trying to explain navigational anomalies, data that didn't make sense unless there was a magnetic source at the top of the world? Modern science has confirmed that Earth's magnetic north is not fixed. It wanders. But certain anomalies do exist, where magnetic fields behave unpredictably. Could ancient mariners navigating by compass have encountered one of these and recorded it as a great magnetic rock? The story of Mercator's Arctic remains one of the strangest episodes in cartographic history, not because of what he knew, but because of what he believed was worth preserving. He didn't invent the tale. He inherited it, cited it, and passed it forward, and then the source vanished. All that remains is the map, a vision of the top of the world, ice-free, alive, symmetrical, and magnetized. A vision that speaks not of fantasy, but of forgotten testimony. What was in Inventio Fortunatae? Why did every copy disappear? Did Mercator draw a myth or a memory? We leave the Arctic and turn now to the vast Pacific, where, half a century earlier, an Ottoman admiral charted coastlines with precision no European had achieved. A man who never sailed those waters. A map no one could explain. Istanbul, 1559. The call to prayer echoes across the city as a solitary scholar sits hunched over parchment, ink flowing from his brush. I, Lisbon, 1502. The city hums with the rhythm of empire, ships arriving from Africa, India, and the Americas, their holds heavy with spices and silks. But tonight, in the shadows of the royal palace, a quieter transaction unfolds. A man named Alberto Cantino, an agent of the Duke of Ferrara, slips a rolled parchment into a cloth bundle. The ink is still fresh. He's paid dearly for it, 12 gold ducats, and he knows the risk. If the Portuguese crown discovers the theft, it could mean death. But what he carries will rewrite the known world. The Cantino planisphere is the oldest surviving Portuguese nautical chart to show the discoveries of the age of exploration. Smuggled to Italy in secret, it became a quiet revelation, for within its lines lie coastlines that, by official records, should not have been known. Brazil is the first anomaly. Though Pedro Álvares Cabral had only discovered Brazil in 1500, the Cantino map shows thousands of miles of South American coastline, far beyond what could have been explored in just 2 years. From roughly 5 degrees north to 35 degrees south, the coast is mapped with a detail that implies not initial contact but sustained reconnaissance. Either Portuguese exploration had advanced much further than acknowledged, or someone had mapped it before. Africa's outline, too, is rendered with uncanny precision. From the Mediterranean to the Cape of Good Hope and up the east coast, the chart reflects a thorough understanding of the continent's shape, surpassing even Vasco da Gama's documented voyages. The Indian Ocean's boundaries, the curvature of India, the islands of Ceylon and the Maldives, all are drawn with a confidence that defies their supposed newness. And then there's the longitude. At a time when no method existed to accurately measure east-west distances, the map's longitudinal placements are disturbingly close to modern accuracy. It shows not just geography, but strategy. The line of the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing the world between Spanish and Portuguese claims, is drawn boldly down the center, suggesting geopolitical intelligence woven into cartographic form. Mainstream historians explain the Cantino map as the result of rapid, undocumented exploration. Portuguese captains may have secretly traveled further than reported, mapping coastlines in haste, then concealing their data to protect imperial ambitions. The theft of the map itself supports this view. It was clearly a state secret. But even this explanation struggles under scrutiny. Could 2 years of hurried voyages produce such comprehensive coastal data across multiple continents, with longitudinal alignment that European cartographers wouldn't achieve for another 2 centuries? Why does the map show not just discovery but refinement, suggesting generations of accumulation? Some propose that the Portuguese had access to older charts, Phoenician, Roman, Arab, that preserved knowledge from earlier seafaring cultures. Portugal's navigators, inheriting these fragments, may have known far more than they let on, choosing secrecy over acclaim. Others point to the Basques, the Norse, the Irish, groups with maritime traditions and rumored transatlantic contact long before Columbus. Could remnants of their maps have found their way into Portuguese hands, compiled, corrected, and then redrawn? The Cantino planisphere doesn't speak. It doesn't claim to reveal a conspiracy. It is simply what it is: a map. But within its elegant lines is a quiet suggestion that Portugal knew the shape of the world long before the world was told. And when King Manuel I learned of the map's theft, his reaction was not indifference. It was fury. He knew what had been taken, and he knew what it meant. That somewhere in those coastlines there was a secret worth stealing. From a stolen document we moved to a printed one, a map that would go public, naming a continent for the first time and showing an ocean that no European had yet seen. Its creator would include something he shouldn't have known, and then, strangely, remove it years later. Saint-Dié, 1507. In a quiet town nestled in the Vosges Mountains of what is now eastern France, a small scholarly academy is preparing to unveil a map that will echo through history. Its creator is Martin Waldseemüller, a German cartographer with access to letters, manuscripts, and the new whispers of a world just beyond the horizon. He carves 12 woodcut panels, assembles them into a vast map nearly 8 feet across, and for the first time in recorded history, writes a single word across a new continent, America. But that isn't the only first. Waldseemüller's map also shows something no European had yet seen: the Pacific Ocean. 6 years before Vasco Núñez de Balboa would stumble upon its shores in 1513, and 14 years before Magellan's ships would cross it, Waldseemüller had already drawn it, a vast body of water separating the newly named America from Asia, not as a decorative guess, but as a defining feature. The map shows South America as a distinct land mass, its western coastline boldly outlined, its separation from Asia declared in ink. And it was a radical statement in a world still adjusting to the shock of Columbus. Most maps of the time still depicted the New World as an extension of Asia, not Waldseemüller's. He saw it, somehow, as a separate hemisphere. How? Waldseemüller cited two sources: the letters of Amerigo Vespucci and the writings of the ancient geographer Ptolemy. Vespucci's letters, published widely in Europe, did suggest a new continent discovered during his voyages, but they offered no proof of an ocean beyond. No charts, no mention of what lay to the west. And Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century, knew nothing of the Americas. So where did the Pacific come from? Mainstream scholars suggest speculation. That Waldseemüller, reasoning from logic and emerging geographical models, guessed there must be another ocean. The Earth was known to be round. If the new land was not Asia, then something had to lie between it and the Far East. But this wasn't idle guesswork. The proportions of the Pacific on Waldseemüller's map are startlingly close to reality. The ocean is shown roughly the correct width. Its placement between the continents is consistent with later surveys. If this was intuition, it was eerily accurate. And then something stranger happened. In 1513, just 6 years later, Waldseemüller released a new edition of his map. The Pacific Ocean was no longer there. The name America had been removed, the separation of continents erased. Why? Historians can only speculate. Was he pressured by political forces? Had Spanish or Portuguese authorities, who guarded navigational knowledge fiercely, demanded a retraction? Did Waldseemüller fear he had revealed too much? Whatever the reason, the redaction suggests something more than academic revision. It suggests he knew, or suspected, that he had touched something sensitive. Could Waldseemüller have had access to secret Portuguese charts? Could he have seen glimpses of a broader world in documents not meant for public eyes? Or was he repeating knowledge older than all of them, maps preserved in cloisters and archives carried from ancient libraries across empires and generations? There is only one surviving copy of the 1507 map, found in a German castle in 1901, purchased by the Library of Congress in 2003 for $10 million. It is not just a record of geography. It is a declaration and a retraction. A map that showed what should not have been known: a name, a coastline, an ocean. And then silence. Next, we travel east, to a place often left out of these stories, to a map made not in Europe, but in Korea. A map that shows Africa accurately before Europeans even reached its southern tip. And once again, we are forced to ask, who was remembering what the world once knew? Seoul, 1402. In the 3rd year of King Taejong's reign during the Joseon dynasty, scholars of the Royal Bureau of Astronomy and Cartography gather in a quiet hall. They are about to complete something extraordinary, a world map that reaches far beyond the known borders of their kingdom. The map is called Kangnido. At first glance, it seems expected. Korea, rendered with exquisite detail, lies at the center. China spreads to the west. Japan curves off the eastern coast. But then the eye wanders south and west, past familiar Asia, and finds something astonishing. Africa, Europe, Arabia. Africa, drawn with remarkable proportion, stretches downward in an elongated taper, more accurate in shape than anything Europeans had produced at the time. This was 86 years before the Portuguese rounded the Cape of Good Hope, decades before European maps reflected even partial southern coasts. And here it is, on a Korean map made by men who had never set foot outside East Asia. How did they know? The Kangnido map was created by Yi Hoi and Kwan Kun, two scholars tasked with synthesizing the best geographical knowledge available to the Korean court. The original no longer survives, but two 15th-century copies do, preserved in Japan. Their maps show not only local lands, but a broad and intricate view of the world, compiled from Chinese, Islamic, and possibly older sources. It was a vision of a world interconnected by trade, knowledge, and memory. Mainstream historians explain the map as a product of information flow. Islamic geographers had mapped much of the known world, and their charts filtered eastward through Mongol intermediaries, Silk Road merchants, and Chinese scholars. Korean cartographers, relying on Chinese compilations, pieced together the global puzzle. This is true, in part, but Islamic maps of the time, though advanced, still misrepresented Africa's proportions, particularly south of the Sahara. Chinese maps showed less detail. And yet the Kangnido gets the shape right, more right, in fact, than many European maps produced a century later. It suggests that the Koreans weren't simply copying what others had guessed. They were referencing something more accurate, something older. Could this accuracy stem from Roman-era knowledge passed eastward along trade routes? Roman coins have been found in India, and records show commercial ties between Rome and Han China. Were Roman maps, or memories of them, preserved in Chinese imperial archives? Some researchers propose an even earlier origin. Phoenician mariners are said to have circumnavigated Africa as early as 600 BCE, according to Herodotus. Could accounts or charts from such voyages have traveled east, recopied, and preserved in scholarly centers long after their original context was forgotten? Others point to Chinese maritime exploration, though Admiral Zheng. He's great. Voyages didn't begin until 1405, 3 years after the Kangnido was created. It's possible that earlier, undocumented voyages had already gathered data on Africa's southern coast. Whatever the source, the implications are clear. Here, in a map made by East Asian scholars over a century before Europeans discovered much of the world, is a vision of Africa not as rumor, but as geography. The map tells a story not of exploration, but of preservation, not of conquest, but of curiosity. It is a reminder that knowledge has never belonged to a single culture or empire. It has traveled on silk, on paper, on breath. The Kangnido challenges the Eurocentric narrative of discovery. It suggests that the world was already known, fragmentedly, imperfectly, but known long before sails rose over new horizons. Next, we turn back west, to Venice, to a family archive, to a map published with a tale of forgotten voyages and mysterious islands, so controversial that some called it a hoax. But even hoaxes have truths hidden in their shadows. Venice, 1558. In a dimly lit study filled with scrolls and sea charts, a man named Zeno the Younger prepares to publish a story that will stir both fascination and fury. He claims to have found letters and a map among his family's papers, documents supposedly written by his ancestors, Niccolò and Antonio Zeno, Venetian navigators who sailed the North Atlantic in the 1390s. If true, their voyage predates Columbus by a century. The map, published alongside the letters, shows Greenland and Iceland. But it also shows two strange lands, Friesland and Estatiland, phantom islands, one of which resembles the North American coast. And the story that accompanies it tells of books written in Latin, stone buildings, and European-style settlements in a distant western land. If authentic, it would change everything. The Zeno map, as it came to be known, quickly drew criticism. Many scholars dismissed it as a fabrication, an attempt by Zeno the Younger to glorify his family's legacy and stake a Venetian claim to the age of discovery. After all, the island of Friesland does not exist. The names and lands on the map, in many cases, don't match real geography. And yet something about it lingers. The map was taken seriously by respected cartographers like Gerardus Mercator and Abraham Ortelius. For the next 2 centuries, Friesland appeared on European maps, its phantom shores copied again and again. These weren't naive men. They had access to the best geographical data of the time. If they were convinced, perhaps there was more to the story. Then there's Greenland. The Zeno map's depiction of Greenland includes bays, peninsulas, and coastal features more accurate than other maps of its era. Some elements align with what would later be confirmed through exploration. That level of detail raises a question. Could the Zeno brothers, or whoever drew the original chart, have had access to real nautical data? Mainstream historians offer explanations. Maybe Zeno the Younger had seen more recent Portuguese or Danish maps and copied their features, weaving them into an older narrative. Maybe the entire account was a fiction built around fragments of Norse saga or second-hand knowledge. But then there's Estotaland, the mysterious land described west of Greenland. In the letters, it is described as temperate, cultivated, and home to people who read Latin. That description echoes Norse settlements in North America, particularly L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, only discovered archaeologically in 1960. Could the Zeno documents be preserving garbled memory of Norse voyages passed down through seafaring communities? Venetian merchants had trade routes stretching from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. It is not impossible that information, maps, stories, encounters was shared between sailors over decades, centuries even. The Zeno brothers, if they existed as described, may have joined Norse expeditions unknowingly venturing farther west than they realized. The map may not be entirely true, nor entirely false. Perhaps it's a mosaic, fragments of authentic navigation woven into a tapestry of myth and pride. Perhaps Zeno the Younger didn't invent everything, but misunderstood what he had found. Or perhaps he knew precisely what he was revealing and chose ambiguity over direct confrontation with history. Because if even part of the Zeno map is authentic, it means that Europeans knew of lands west of Greenland a full century before Columbus, and they forgot, or buried it. Next, we journey back to Italy, to a monastery island in the Venetian lagoon. There, a monk would create one of the largest and most detailed maps of the medieval world, one that turned everything upside down, literally. South at the top, north at the bottom, and a claim that someone had already sailed around Africa decades before the Portuguese. Venice. Circa 1450. On the quiet island of Murano, in a cloistered monastery off the Venetian coast, a Camaldolese monk named Fra Mauro bends over a vast circle of parchment. 6 feet in diameter, rich in color and script, his map is unlike any other, not because of its size, but because of its orientation. South is at the top, north at the bottom. A world turned upside down. But that's not the radical part. Amid the thousands of notes crowding its margins, citations of travelers, scholars, merchants, and ancient authorities, one line stands out. A claim that a ship from Europe had sailed around the southern tip of Africa in 1420, 68 years before Bartolomeo Dias's historic voyage. The Fra Mauro map, commissioned by King Afonso V of Portugal, was meant to be a comprehensive representation of global knowledge. Fra Mauro drew from every source he could find: Islamic maps, Roman texts, Chinese accounts, oral reports from sailors returning to Venice's bustling ports. His map is a collage of memory, trade, science, and speculation. And yet, some of it is simply too accurate. The Indian Ocean is drawn as open, not landlocked as Ptolemaic tradition insisted. The outline of Africa is shockingly precise, extending well past the equator, curling around the Cape of Good Hope and continuing up the east coast. This at a time when European ships had only reached a fraction of that coastline. Fra Mauro didn't just copy old mistakes, he corrected them. In one annotation, he writes of a ship from India that sailed southwest around the African continent and then back to the Indian Ocean, a claim that would be proven only decades later. In another, he describes the Atlantic connecting to the Indian Ocean, long before Europeans had seen it for themselves. Where did this information come from? Mainstream scholars suggest that Fra Mauro had access to Arabic and possibly Chinese sources that preserved better geographical knowledge of Africa than was known in Europe. Muslim navigators had sailed the Indian Ocean for centuries, and Chinese fleets under Admiral Zheng He had reached East Africa by the early 1400s. Perhaps merchants returning to Venice, then a hub of east-west trade, carried this knowledge with them. Perhaps monks and scholars translated documents that no longer survive. But Fra Mauro insists on something more specific. He references ancient sources. He cross-checks multiple accounts. And most provocatively, he claims a European ship made the voyage around Africa in 1420, almost 7 decades before the Portuguese officially succeeded. Was he referring to a secret Portuguese mission? A voyage later suppressed or forgotten in favor of more politically convenient timelines? Or was he preserving something even older? If the Romans, or the Phoenicians before them, had once circumnavigated Africa, could traces of that knowledge have survived, hidden in texts that passed from Alexandria to Constantinople to Venice? Fra Mauro wasn't a sailor. He was a compiler, a listener. His genius was not in discovery, but in synthesis, blending memory with observation, belief with evidence. His map reflects a world still half-dreamed, but more accurate than anyone could have guessed at the time. And then there is the symbolism. By placing south at the top, he challenged not only the conventions of mapping, but the very perspective through which people viewed the Earth. It was a reminder, our view of the world is shaped as much by where we stand as by what we see. In his circular frame, the world turns slowly, thoughtfully. And so we ask, was Fra Mauro drawing the Earth as it was, or as it had once been remembered? We now turn to the final section of this journey through impossible maps. A reflection. Not just on what these maps show, but what they mean. Because each one points not only to a place, but to a mystery within us all. How we remember, how we forget, and what we choose to believe about the past. Across centuries and continents, a pattern emerges. From Ottoman parchment to Korean scrolls, Renaissance prints to monastic circles, maps appear that whisper the same strange thing. Someone knew this world before we thought they did. Piri Reis, sketching Antarctica beneath the ice. Oronce Fine, detailing rivers and mountains hidden for millennia. Philippe Boisch, drawing a channel beneath a frozen continent 2 centuries before seismic surveys confirmed it. Mercator mapping an Arctic sea no one had seen. Ahmed tracing the Pacific with impossible precision. Cantino stealing a chart that showed more than official discovery allowed. Waldseemüller revealing an ocean years before anyone arrived at its shores. The Korean Kangnido showing Africa's true shape ahead of Europe. The Zeno map echoing Norse voyages long dismissed. Fra Mauro turning the world upside down and drawing what would later prove true. Each map, a fragment. Each map, a question. What do we do with them? Mainstream scholarship rightly urges skepticism. Not every curve of coastline is accurate. Not every claim is verifiable. Some maps were embellished, distorted, imagined. Coincidence, pattern recognition, myth disguised as memory. These are real forces in history. And yet, the coincidences accumulate. It is not the accuracy of one map that unsettles. It is the recurrence, the fact that multiple cartographers, separated by centuries and cultures, depicted things they shouldn't have known, things that would only later be confirmed by satellites, sonar, and polar expeditions. If even one of these maps contains a sliver of truth beyond its time, it opens the door to a more complicated view of the past, not one of hidden empires or forbidden histories, but of knowledge lost and rediscovered, of memories passed down, misunderstood, reinterpreted, a global echo heard through the ink of maps. There are no secret civilizations hiding beneath the waves, no ancient satellites orbiting the Earth, but perhaps there were sailors whose journeys were forgotten, libraries whose scrolls turned to dust before being copied, roots recorded not on paper but in stories, in trade, in tradition. Perhaps history does not move in a straight line, but in a spiral. The real mystery isn't who discovered the world first. It's how much of that discovery we chose to remember, and how much we allowed to slip away. What if the age of discovery was, in part, an age of rediscovery? What if the explorers we celebrate were not the first to see, but the first to be believed? Maps are human. They are imperfect. They reflect not only what was known, but what was hoped for. They are shaped by the limits of tools, the biases of cultures, and the mysteries of time, and yet they endure. Because within their coastlines and contours lies something deeper than geography, a yearning to understand, to explain, to connect, to place ourselves on a canvas larger than we can see. So when we look at these maps, when we trace the lines that defy chronology, we are not chasing conspiracies. We are listening for echoes of sailors, of scribes, of scholars, of forgotten hands drawing remembered shores. What matters is not whether every detail is true. What matters is that someone tried to map the world, and that in doing so, they left behind questions we are still learning to ask. In the final chapter, we'll gather the threads, not to tie them into a neat conclusion, but to reflect on what this journey has shown us. About truth, about memory, and about how we draw the world. In the end, what are maps but mirrors, not just of mountains and coastlines, but of who we are, what we choose to see, and what we're willing to forget. As we gather these scattered charts, Piri Reis, Fine, Boacha, Mercator, Ahmed, Cantino, Waldseemüller, the Kangnido, Zeno, Fra Mauro, we find ourselves staring not at ancient mysteries, but at reflections of our own curiosity. Each map challenges a piece of the narrative we've been told. Each one suggests the possibility that human knowledge is not a steady march forward, but a pulse, gaining, losing, regaining. We imagine history as a ladder. Each generation climbs higher. But what if it's more like a tide, rising in places, receding in others, carrying insight to distant shores before pulling it back beneath the surface? The maps we've explored in this story aren't evidence of lost empires or suppressed truths. They're evidence of something even more powerful and more fragile, human memory. We remember through paper, through stories, through whispers passed down in the margins of texts. And sometimes, when the timing is right, those memories resurface. Misunderstood, misattributed, but there. That's what these maps might be. Traces of voyages forgotten, of knowledge copied and recopied until its origin blurred, of scholars who trusted sources older than themselves, and of civilizations that mapped their world with tools we no longer recognize. Not magic, not myth, just memory, worn and weathered, like ink fading beneath fingertips. It's tempting to demand proof, to ask for the missing originals, to hold these fragments to modern standards and dismiss anything unverifiable. That instinct protects us from fantasy, but it also blinds us to the poetry of history. Because sometimes the most important truths aren't the ones that can be proven. They're the ones that remind us how much we've yet to understand. What matters is that people tried. They tried to describe a world larger than themselves. They tried to preserve what they had learned. And whether they were right or wrong, whether they guessed or remembered, they gave us something enduring. The courage to draw what they could not see, to say, "This is the world as I believe it might be." And in doing so, they remind us that every age believes it knows the whole story, until the next age redraws the map. So we return to the beginning, to that quiet unease, the sense that something is missing from the timeline, that the world was perhaps more connected, more explored, more remembered than we give it credit for. And if that's true, if these maps are not accidents, but echoes, then the real mystery isn't how people knew what they shouldn't have, it's how we forgot what they already did. In our final part, we will step back, not to conclude, but to reflect, to look at the pattern these maps reveal, not of geography, but of humanity, and to ask the question that lies beneath all others: how do we know what we know? Epilogue. What if the past is not lost, but layered, like sediment beneath our feet, like ink beneath newer ink on a reused scroll? We imagine history as linear, a path from ignorance to understanding. But the maps we've explored hint at something else, a palimpsest, a memory written, forgotten, overwritten, yet never fully erased. Piri Reis, Orance Fine, Felipe Buach, Gerardus Mercator, Ahmed Cantino, Waldsee Muller, the Kangnido mapmakers, the Zeno family, Fra Mauro. Each told part of a story, not just about coastlines and continents, but about the strange persistence of knowledge, how it travels, how it lingers. None of these maps alone proves an ancient seafaring civilization. None demands we rewrite history with grand new theories. But together they whisper something humbler, lower, and more profound. That memory, not certainty, is the true thread of human progress. We remember in fragments. We misplace what we once knew, and sometimes we rediscover it not with fanfare, but with confusion. A coastline on an old map, a mountain range beneath the ice, a name inscribed centuries too soon. These are not errors, they are echoes. And they remind us that knowledge is not just built, it is also inherited, preserved in texts, in tools, in tales, stored in places we forget to look, and occasionally in maps, quietly sitting in drawers, waiting to be unrolled. We do not need to believe in lost continents or hidden powers to be amazed. The truth is already wondrous enough, that people, in ages before our own, looked at the same stars, sailed the same oceans, and tried, against all odds, to understand their place in the vastness. They may have seen things we no longer see. They may have known things we no longer know, but they left us their lines, their curves, their coastlines drawn by hand. And it is up to us to decide what to do with them. Do we dismiss what doesn't fit? Do we call every anomaly coincidence? Or do we listen to the maps and to the silences around them? Because in the end, the question is not whether Antarctica was mapped before its discovery, or whether forgotten monks sailed to the Arctic, or whether a Korean scholar saw the shape of Africa ahead of his time. The question is, how do we treat what the past tries to tell us? With doubt? With wonder? With reverence? Or maybe with humility? For the world is vast, time is long, and the maps we trust today will one day be artifacts themselves. What then will they say about us? We close this journey not with an answer, but with an invitation to look again, to ask better questions, and to remember that sometimes the oldest lines can still lead us forward.